You are listening to the Holistic Life Navigation Podcast. I am your host, Luis Mojica. I'm a holistic therapist, and my goal is to teach people how to find safety in themselves. I use nutrition, herbalism, self-inquiry, and somatic therapy to heal the body and mind of trauma. I have learned that each and every one of us has the ability to heal, to love, and to access all of the answers we're looking for. To do this, we first need to learn how to listen to our bodies and understand our minds. Let us begin. Today's episode is all about addiction. Addiction, oh my goodness. You can't have addiction unless you already have trauma. That's the first thing we need to understand. The second thing is a very simple statement that came to me when I was meditating one day. I was meditating on addiction, and these words just entered my body. And they were, addiction is the result of not knowing how to find safety in your own body. Addiction is the result of not knowing how to find safety in your own body. It's really important to take that in. Because trauma and being traumatized is the somatic experience of threat. Believing there's always a threat, which means we don't feel safe. So when we develop with trauma, we develop with threat, we live from a physical gesture, we live from a physical belief, from a physical identity or perception, a somatic perception, let's say, of I'm not safe. This world isn't safe. Those people aren't safe. It depends on your trauma, of course, but it will translate into not feeling safe. So when we're children and we're growing up in abusive homes, or we're being bullied in school every day, or we lose someone we love at a very young age, or we break a bone in our body, or we see something really scary on TV. Remember, if you listen to my earlier episode 4, about trauma is our birthright, trauma isn't the event, right? It's the body's experience of the event and the body's response of the event. The event itself doesn't say if you're traumatized or not. So you can't say, well, I wasn't abused, I have no trauma. You have to ask your body, what did you feel when your father was away? How did it feel when you had to go to school? What did it feel like when your first lover cheated on you? These are really simple lifetime experiences that we all have. And whether we become traumatized or not depends on how our bodies held onto the overwhelm of these experiences or released them. And when we're children, we depend on co-regulators. We need people. We need pets. We need environments that feel really safe to regulate in. If we have really consistent co-regulators, we can endure almost anything and come back from it. But when we are trying to self-regulate as children, we are planting the seeds for addiction. It starts from age 7, where you feel really, let's say, shy at school, and you're made fun of, or you're not making any friends, or the teacher gives you an F, and you're not with your family, you're not with your friends, you just feel alone, and you feel scared, and you feel overwhelmed. And you come home, and you start eating cookies. Your body in that moment has experienced what it's like to regulate with a substance. And for all children, that first substance is food. And if we want to go even earlier, as all babies, that first substance is milk, mother's milk, or formula, depending on what you were fed. The act of drinking, of suckling, of the warm, sweet milk is our first experience of regulating with a substance, and that's upon coming into this world. So we develop with the sensational experience of regulation. It's a beautiful thing. It's how the body is made. When we start using it to regulate more and more and more, we start becoming dependent on a substance more and more and more. Most children who are traumatized, I should say, or dealing with trauma, and they don't have a lot of co-regulators around them, or even if they do and they feel too ashamed, so they retreat and isolate, they'll go toward video games, they'll go toward food, they'll go toward zoning out on sugar, they'll go toward sometimes reading books for hours and ignoring the space around them. Now, these substances, video games, books, sugar, food, these substances themselves aren't extremely dangerous. It's how they're being used by a child's mind. A child saying, this is the only place I feel safe, so I'm going to just dissolve into it. That's the beginning of addiction. Then you get a little older and you experience alcohol or marijuana or cigarettes or sex or cocaine or meth or heroin or pills, you name it. And you find a substance that makes you feel even safer. And so addiction is the result of not knowing how to find safety in your own body and having to find it outside of yourself. And it starts at a really young age. And I'm saying this because it's so important to understand that when the body is traumatized or overwhelmed and it's not regulated, it's what we call dysregulated. And dysregulated simply means it doesn't feel safe. Biochemically, it means we have a lot of adrenaline and cortisol. Biologically, it means we have high blood pressure, anxiety, depression. Physiologically, we have constriction. We have nausea. We have headaches. We have TMJ. We have tight muscles and joints. So the substance relieves all of those symptoms temporarily until it's metabolized. And a substance can be chocolate cake or it can be heroin. The substance doesn't matter. Some substances are much more potent than others, and those are the ones that will kill you very quickly. But anything that's used to regulate is a substance. It's a substance for regulation, and the act of needing it is addiction. Again, I say this so we can see the innocence in addiction, so we can see the prevalence in addiction, and so we can start dissolving the stigmas around addiction. It's not self-sabotage, it's not bad behavior, and it's nothing to feel ashamed or guilty of. It is a biological response to not feeling safe. And in a society that fears vulnerability and weakness, we lock them up and call them criminals. We throw them into jail. We say, why did you do that? Versus, what happened to you? And imagine our culture if we could shift, why did you do this? Into what happened to you? It would invite the person using into an inner dialogue with themselves to start uprooting their traumatic memories, the events in their life that were really painful, that they've never spoken, that some of them don't even know they have. And by doing this very slowly, we could heal a culture that is criminalized and treated poorly simply because they don't feel safe. Addicts are the most vulnerable of our society because they're guilty for not feeling safe, right? That's how simple it is. What they have to do sometimes to feel safe becomes very dangerous. Maybe it becomes, I'm doing air quotes here, criminal. But if we can understand the root of it, we can actually heal it. And that's what my next guest is all about. He has endured his own over 2 decades of addiction to cocaine and sexual abuse and childhood trauma. He endured the trauma and the addiction and the life experience of that so he could heal it and then teach others how to do so. His name is David McNamara, and he founded a holistic recovery center in Kingston, New York called Samadhi, New York. And it has an incredible group of people, I'm included, and we are all working together to destigmatize and heal addiction at the root by identifying trauma, by nourishing the body with healthy foods, by nourishing the spirit with healthy thoughts, by learning meditation, trauma-informed yoga. And together we're weaving this holistic web so people can just drop in for free and begin healing themselves of the stigma and the physiology that creates their addiction. Byron Katie always says that shame and guilt are fertilizers for addiction. So if we can stop shaming others and ourselves, we can stop feeding the addiction just by doing that. Today, I am joined by David McNamara of the Samadhi Recovery Center. David is a recovery coach, substance abuse counselor, filmmaker, and Zen practitioner. He's currently completing his certification in harm reduction psychotherapy with Dr. Andrew Tatarski. David recently embarked on making a documentary film called Disconnected: Healing an Addicted Society. While making the film, he discovered an incredible group of therapists, teachers, and mentors who all believed it was time to treat addiction in a new way. Interviewing them would give birth to what is now called Samadhi. Samadhi is a holistic recovery center based in Kingston, New York for those suffering from substance abuse, related disorders, and addictions. The community-based outreach center opened in April of 2019, and Samadhi's team and board includes physicians, psychotherapists, yoga teachers, somatic therapists, and nutritionists. It's even lucky enough to be endorsed by Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Valerie Mason-John, and Dr. Andrew Tatarski. I currently serve the center by offering a monthly online healing circle for addiction, free of charge. And as the center expands and grows, I plan to serve as the director of nutrition and holistic detox services to help support the bodies of those in withdrawal. Thank you so much for joining me, David.
Thank you, Luis. It's great to be here.
So I want to ask you, for everyone listening, I'd like to hear the stories of the people behind the projects first. Mm-hmm. So I want to know your own personal experiences with addiction that led you to wanting to do this work for others.
Absolutely. So, my addiction, unfortunately, ran for over 20 years, probably 22, 23 years. And it was a constant cycle of self-deprecation and just not understanding, why I would continue to go back to my addiction when I was hurting the people that I loved, and then hating myself more, and then wanting to use because I hated myself more, and that just went on and on and on, and it was really painful, and I hurt a lot of people. And in the last few years, because of the work that I'm doing now, I realized that the person I hurt the most was myself. Because I never really looked at that. It was always about the other, what I did to other people. And there were times during that whole addiction process. There were definitely times where I attempted to stop. Through 12-step groups or different modalities, and I would get a year or 2 years, in one case 5 years, and I would slip back, because what I found during those periods is that I had made a commitment to myself. I have a very strong will, and I made a commitment to myself not to use substances, but I was miserable. I was really unhappy, and my addiction shifted from substances to anger. I think in those periods, and it's only a matter of time, when you don't look at your mind and you don't observe where the anger is coming from, that it eventually turns into where you just let go and go back into your addiction. um, so eventually I got to a place where I had 3 or 4 years again in 12-step programs, and this is in New York City. And I had been exposed to Zen Buddhism in my early 20s. I had practiced very seriously for a number of years in my early 20s. Was connected with my martial arts training at that time, and it was funny because I would go in and out of mindfulness and meditation and Buddhist practice and using drugs, and I couldn't do them at the same time. So I would kind of binge on drugs, and I would stop doing that, and then I would go and meditate, and it was this internal struggle that went on for years and years. And so after I had been back in 12-step program for about 3 years, I was like, there's something missing. There's definitely something missing. And I, in 12 steps, there's a saying, it's God of your understanding. And I remember I said to my sponsor, I said something to somebody who had, been in the program for a long time. And I said, I don't really understand what God means to me. I don't really, and they said, oh, your higher power can be anything. It can be a chair. And I was like, okay, well, I think I need to look somewhere else, because I don't think the chair is going to do it. And I went back. I went to the next. So then I basically, what had happened was I had a relapse, and at that time my wife and my daughter, when I came home, they were gone, because that was like the ultimatum. And I went to a meeting in New York City at 6 a.m, because in New York City there's meetings 24 hours a day. And the woman who was sharing her story at the meeting was talking about being at a party and seeing somebody having a glass of champagne, and they drank the champagne and they put down the glass and they walked away from it. And she said, I realized I could never be that person because I'm abnormal. She actually used the word abnormal. And all of a sudden it hit me, and I stood up in the meeting and I said, thank you all so much. And I went to walk out, and he said, oh, don't leave. It's, and I said, no, I'm actually fine, because I realized I didn't believe that I was abnormal. And I literally walked down to the subway, got on the train, and went to Brooklyn, because there's a Zen temple in Brooklyn that's connected to the monastery up here. And I found somebody that I've known for years, and I sat down and talked to them about my addiction, about my life. And in Zen, it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, there's the cushion. And start to discover what's happening within yourself. And that was the beginning of my journey. And I went to that temple every morning and every night, for 3 or 4 years, and started to do week-long retreats and all types of really intense Buddhist practice. And I had this balance between my 12-step recovery and my Buddhist practice. And then someone told me about a gentleman named Noah Levine, who wrote a book called Refuge Recovery. He also wrote a book called Dharma Punks, and they had a group of people down in East Village who were studying Buddhism in a kind of unorthodox way, but something that was really accessible. And it turned out that most of the people in that group happened to be in recovery. So out of that grew this movement, which we now call Refuge Recovery.
So I want to go back a moment. I'm curious, when you said you went and sat on the cushion to discover, what was it? Well, in those really early days, what was it you first discovered? What was coming through to you? And also, in anything you're uncomfortable answering, tell me. What was your addiction? What was the drug of choice?
Cocaine was the primary drug of choice.
And you said 20 years.
Yep.
Because it's amazing. And just for people listening, 20 years of being addicted to cocaine and then suddenly walking out of a 12-step meeting and sitting on a cushion, that's very radical, to be with yourself, because that's the hardest thing when you're addicted, to be with yourself. So what was that like, those early months being with yourself like that?
Well, it's interesting, because I feel like I started that journey when I was in my early 20s. but I wasn't ready yet. I
When
wasn't.
you were going back and forth, you mean?
Yeah, and it was interesting because when people from the Zen Buddhist organization would try to talk to me, I would be like, oh, I gotta go. Like I wouldn't connect with anyone. I would just go and sit and then leave. And because I wasn't ready to make a commitment, and when I first really sat with myself, it's interesting that I was just telling somebody this story the other day. The first weekend session that I did. So that's an intensive. That's an intensive that they suggest that you do before you do a week. So you go on a Friday night, you meditate for a few hours on a Friday night, then you meditate all day Saturday, for about 8 or 9 hours with breaks in between, and then Sunday morning you sit. And I remember on Saturday, and I had actually just come off of a relapse. I went from a relapse. I got on the bus and I went to Mount Trumper to this retreat. And I remember being in such great pain, emotional and psychological, spiritual pain. But I made a commitment. I made a commitment for that weekend that I was going to stay on this cushion. And and I went in to see the abbot of the monastery at the time. They have face-to-face teaching. The abbot at the time, and I said, I feel like I'm pulling my skin off. I said, I feel like I'm beyond naked. I feel like my organs are exposed. Like I've never felt such vulnerability and such pain. And he looked at me and he started laughing. And it's kind of like a Zen thing, And I said, well, why are you laughing at me? And he said, I'm sorry. He goes, it's just that it's going to get worse. and but he meant it in the kindest way. He meant it's going to get worse. The pain's going to get worse, but you're going to discover more. And then on Sunday morning, I woke up and my first thought was, well, wow, when can I do this again? Because I knew that happened. I knew that something had shifted in me, and that this was different. This was different than anything I've experienced before.
So for you, it started, would you say it was more somatic than intellectual, that physical sensation, or was there a lot of intellectual imagery and things coming up too?
Absolutely, because I think until that time it was purely intellectual.
That's interesting.
That's
interesting. Yeah. So for you, the cushion and sitting and being with yourself, and maybe you can share with everyone who's unfamiliar with that type of meditation style, like what it is you do.
Right. So basically, what we're learning how to do is to pay attention to our mind. And it's so in other words, when all of the thoughts, and the minute you get quiet, a lot of thoughts come, and all of the thoughts that come, just noticing them without judgment, which takes years and years and years of practice. Because what happens is a thought comes, and then you get caught in the thought. Somebody across the room in the meditation hall looks at you, and you think, why are they looking at me? That person never liked me. I don't know, and you go down this whole rabbit hole of, and meanwhile, the person's not even thinking about you, but you think they are. But noticing those patterns of mind, and not without judgment, it's really, this is something that we stress at Samadhi. It's really important when you're watching the patterns of mind to really be kind to yourself. There's nothing wrong with your delusional thoughts. They're just part of who we are. And the more that you get to understand the way that your mind works, the more that you can befriend yourself is what I find. And really the process is that we start out by focusing on our breath, because the breath is something that's always available. It's very simple. It's there. So when these thoughts come, we notice them, and we notice when we get caught in a story or making a list. And then we just notice that, we let go of it, and we come back to just breathing. So the first few years of meditation practice, that's pretty much the practice.
So the breath is your anchor, like when you're finding yourself. It's really nice. And I'm glad you were saying that, because one thing I write about often is the mind being the most traumatizing thing in our experience as humans, because we have these experiences and events and situations and abuse and such, shock traumas, car accidents, but the mind is what replays it. And even if we don't have significant trauma, like you said, you're sitting in the cafeteria and you see someone look at you and your mind runs with that. Every thought has a somatic experience attached to it. And so when you have a thought that's stressful, it has a stressful somatic experience. which dysregulates us, right? And then we seek the regulator, which is the substance. So for you, as you were becoming more regulated in yourself by essentially feeling safe with your thinking, was addiction just obsolete, or was it hard? Did you have to also really keep yourself from going toward friends that were doing coke or going to a bar? What was that like for you?
Um, I mean, in the beginning, I avoided it. I mean, mostly because I never had the feeling that, oh, I can't go into the bar because I'm going to be, but quite honestly, and to this day, at a certain point, it's kind of not really fun, because I'll be with a group of people. I mean, I still have many friends who drink, and some drink to excess, and if I go out with them, even to dinner or whatever, and then afterwards, and they, all of a sudden the volume goes way up. They keep telling me the same story that they told me at the beginning of dinner, And at a certain point, I'm kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to leave now, go home and go to sleep.
Now, is that the same with coke? Have you been around people using cocaine and you have the same experience? What's that like?
Well, I mean, I've definitely been in rooms where I know that because I can recognize it, but not where it's like out in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really travel in those circles anymore,
Got it.
but I mean, I work in the center. I work with people who
Right.
smoke crack around the corner and walk in, and I recognize the high, and I know exactly. I mean, I'll ask them, but I already know what it is that they're high on. So I'm around it quite often. Yeah, well, basically, what happened, I guess, is after about 4 or 5 years into my Buddhist practice, I was living in New York City, and my wife and my daughter had gone out of town, and that normally would be the time when I would pick up the phone and start making. And I remember we had a courtyard, and I remember just meditating and sitting there and thinking like, okay, so looking at the pattern of what I would normally do in the situation. And I thought, I don't really have any desire to do that at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked out into the courtyard and I looked up at the sky, and I just was like, wow, I'm free.
Mm.
You know?
That's something I really want everyone to hear, because when I think about healing addiction, to me it's beyond avoidance. I think avoidance is a really responsible step, and I think when it's all you have, it's a really beautiful thing to begin with. And 12 steps and all these things that contain us. But there's this freedom that comes from the actual substance becoming obsolete because it just doesn't serve you anymore. It's like you really got to the root of the trauma that led you to use. And
Yeah.
so when you had that environment set up where they left, and it normally would spark almost Pavlovian, that Pavlovian instinct, I'm going to go, order, I'm going to go buy some, I'm going to use, and you just didn't have that need. That's kind of my hope for everybody who goes into the addiction healing journey.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you said that, Luis, because I was thinking about that a lot. I mean, it's a common thing. I mean, even some of the rehabs that I've worked in, where it's this mantra, like just stay away from people, places, and things. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you do that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, I agree.
Or if your sister gets married, are you not going to go to the wedding? I mean,
That's right. That's right. It's this really kind of like I said, for some people, it's a necessary first step, but I don't think it should be the final.
right, right, right. And that was kind of what set me off on this path, because I said, if it's just that I'm going to do this by avoidance, it doesn't seem like a very full life to me. It doesn't.
So now that sparks another question. So there you are sitting on this cushion 4 or 5 years early on in this discovery of just essentially quitting cold turkey, right? Like you walked out of that meeting when you heard abnormal. You didn't identify with abnormal, which I love for everyone to hear as well. Because there is this rhetoric in a lot of, uh, I guess, 12-step circles and even other circles that, like you're powerless and you're abnormal. And that's certainly not the case. What was that?
You have a disease.
Or disease, correct. And I think it's for initially for people, it helps them to identify that. It gives them something to put it on.
Mhm.
But by putting the addiction onto the term disease, you actually lose the root, which is trauma. You don't have a disease, you have a trauma, and your body's just reacting normally from being traumatized. So
Right.
I like how you destigmatized yourself by walking out. So there you are for 4 or 5 years. Did trauma emerge? Like were there hidden events, feelings, experiences, things that you were never in touch with that came up on that cushion? Or was it purely just being with your thoughts?
No. It's when they talk about like the dark night of the soul, I mean, there was a lot of that. There was quite a bit of that. I mean, I was I was raped when I was 12. And I went to therapy. I've gone to therapy around it for years and years and years. And it, but I never really got to the root of it, because the root of it was the somatic piece. This not feeling safe, that you and I have spoken about before, that there is a certain, of a person has a certain smell or a certain body type or a certain look. I can notice in my body, and it's that person is not the person that harmed me, but in my body, I'll notice there'll be a certain tightness in my chest. There'll be my hands. It's like fight, flight, or freeze is kicking in, and that's just one experience. There's so many other things that have happened to me. I mean, I work, with Samadhi. I work very closely with the with law enforcement because we have to. I mean, it's part of it's been really really great. But sometimes I'm in a room with 15 or 16 law enforcement officers, and I'm kind of like, hey, what am I doing?
So I want to pause there because um, you know, I think what's so important what you just were saying was that one event of sexual assault, how in your body, like you talked about it, right, in therapy, and you were conscious of it and you worked on it. It wasn't something you blacked out necessarily, right? But you didn't get to really understand what your body was doing with it. And
Right.
so when you were talking about that, and some of you who are listening to this, this will also be on YouTube. But what David's showing is this motion of a bracing. The body's constricting and bracing. When he says fight, flight, or freeze, that's biologically what a trauma response is. It's a constriction to brace for impact. And that's really important because every time our bodies are bracing for impact, what they're really wanting is regulation. And when you don't understand the somatic piece, you're identifying what's happened to you or what was done to you, and you're making sense of it, but your body's still bracing for impact. And then the cocaine, the heroin, the coffee, the alcohol, whatever it is regulating your system every time you're bracing for impact. So when David's saying someone with a smell, someone of the same gender, someone of the same whatever, that reminds the body of that human in that interaction, which happens a lot in life for the rest of our lives. The body's responding and remembering. There's a somatic memory. That's really key here. So I thank you for sharing that. And as more things were emerging for you and you were understanding them in your body and releasing them, I'm assuming, like you said, safety, there was a safety you were gaining, which maybe you would have gotten in the past from drugs.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting, this, I've been reading this book on, it was about a conference in 2013 about attachment theory and its relationship to addiction. And it just made me think of you because in the very beginning, it says, is addiction a search for a secure base? They said that phrase, like it sums up the entire conference, which it does. And that's what I found. I mean, like within cocaine, there was this feeling of empowerment. I felt strong. I didn't feel like weak or like a victim, which was my trauma, one of my traumas. And I felt, this feeling of being empowered, because there's a whole, self-medication hypothesis too, why certain people move towards certain substances or behaviors based on what their trauma is or what their.
I'm so happy you shared that personal embodiment of what cocaine did for you. Because so many people will think, well, weed makes sense, it relaxes you, but why does someone want to do a stimulant? Why does someone do pills? Well, why the uppers? And I think it's so important for people to hear what David just said, that like when he was saying feeling weak and feeling victim, feeling scared, insecure, that's a childlike state from that kind of assault, that kind of trauma. And anything else you endured as a child, through your life. It can be bullying, it can be parent issues, anything as a child. So if you've internalized that weakness and somaticized it, we develop with that. So we develop with a somatic experience of being weak and frail. And cocaine is going to make you feel really invincible. So that was like the most innocent way your body knew how to medicate and transform what it was carrying somatically, unbeknownst to itself.
Right.
And that's the innocence of addiction, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So with that, then, where does refuge recovery come in? Tell us what that does within this container we're talking about. How does that help differently to 12-step?
Absolutely. So, so at the base of refuge recovery, they've adapted the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. So the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, it simply put, are that one is that life will include pain and suffering. It's inevitable that life will include pain and suffering. The second part is that craving and desire are generally the cause of that suffering. If I have pain and I want it to not be there or be something else or get rid of it, that's a craving, and that causes me suffering. So, and then the third way is that there is a way out, and the fourth truth is that here's the path. So refuge recovery has adapted those four truths to be that addiction creates suffering, craving and desire are the cause of addiction, and so on and so forth. And then that leads into the Eightfold Path, which the Eightfold Path is really a way of living, and it's so basically the first part of the Eightfold Path is understanding. The second part is intention. The third part is communication and sense of community. The fourth part is action. The fifth part is livelihood and service. So having an appropriate livelihood. I mean, if I'm selling drugs or I'm a bartender, it's I shouldn't say bartender. That's more complicated. But if I'm doing something that is not really in the way that I want to live, I need to look at that livelihood. 6 is effort. 7 is mindfulness meditations, which includes the four. There's basically 4 modes of mindfulness that we learn as we go on, and then the 8th is concentration meditations. So these aren't, and these steps are not a linear path. Like in the 12 steps, you start with 1 and you go up to 12. If anyone is familiar with Buddhism, there's a wheel, and that has 8 spokes, and each of those 8 spokes is one of the factors of the path. And so this is a cyclical. They all have to be approached kind of at the same time. And then within that, like the 4 foundations of mindfulness are mindfulness of the body and breath, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind states, and mindfulness of mind objects. And those are a little bit more progressive in the way that we learn them, just because you have to achieve a certain level of concentration before you can actually experience these different levels of awareness. But it's I always tell people when they come in, they say, well, you're an expert. I said, no, there's no experts. There's no, it's everyone is, I said, I sit there and make lists in my head too. It's like, I've been doing this for 25 years. I said, and then I say, oh, I'm doing that. And then I come back, come back to my practice. And there's no good or bad meditation. That lens that we have of everything being good or bad or having a goal.
And why for you do you feel refuge recovery? Why would you prefer that? Like, if someone could understand that versus 12-step, what pieces do you think are more effective, or what kind of person gets more out of refuge recovery from your experience?
Right. Well, I mean, I want to say too, because 12-step programs work very well for millions of people, and if that works for you, then you should do that. There are many of us that it didn't work, and what I find with refuge recovery is that we rarely talk about the substances that we use. Pretty much we talk about behaviors and underlying causes. And each meeting starts with a 20-minute guided meditation. So in the beginning, the meditations are mindfulness of the breath, which is just teaching you how to learn to concentrate, and forgiveness. We alternate between those two. So the forgiveness meditation is not just asking for forgiveness from people that you've harmed, which is what most people are familiar with. The second part of the meditation is offering forgiveness to people that have harmed you. And the third part of the meditation is forgiving yourself. And I've had people in rehab say, well, the first part should be forgiving yourself. And I said, how many people think that that's the hardest part? And all the hands go up, and it's like, I said, that's why it's third, because it's easier to ask other people for forgiveness than it is to forgive ourselves.
I love that. I mean, as you're saying that, the fact that it comes back to the self, which I really like, versus just focusing on what you've done to others or the world around you. Within that coming back to the self, which just in my mind takes me to trauma again and shame and guilt and such. Do you find everyone you've worked with, your clients, that everyone's experienced a trauma? Everyone that has an addiction? Like, what's your experience with that, the correlation?
I have yet to find a person who does not have trauma in their story somewhere. I don't, because I don't want to say absolutely it doesn't. I mean, I've had this conversation with Gabor, because he says unequivocally, that's Gabor. It's like unequivocally, every single person has trauma, and a lot of times people have trauma, but they don't recognize it as trauma, because people think trauma has to be, sexual assault or physical abuse, or I was locked in the closet, or some. And I've met people that I worked with them for a year or more, and then at a certain point they said, well, I practiced music in an orchestra because that's what my father wanted me to do. And I said, well, was your father happy that you did that? And they said, no, my father, I could never please my father. And it's like, right. And they never saw that as trauma. They never ever saw that as trauma, because they had a really beautiful upbringing. They lived in a beautiful house. They had everything they ever wanted, but they never had the approval of their father.
See, what David's saying here is so important for everyone to hear, because there's one way of thinking in the world that trauma is the event, which when you're saying assault or shock or being locked in a closet, abuse, torture. But the reality, as a somatic therapist especially, and this is why Gabor says unequivocally, is trauma is the body's response to an event. So the event is completely, has nothing to do with the trauma, because the trauma isn't the event, which we used to think it was. It's how the body responded to it. So if you talk about your client who was in the orchestra for 10 years and their father never approved of them, the way they held that experience of not being approved of, that was their trauma, right? And that's really important for people to hear who are listening, because so much shame and guilt around addiction comes from what I've seen with my clients, from clients that come from, quote, really good families and have really good childhoods. Why am I self-sabotaging? Why would I do this to my mother? Why am I ruining my family name? Well, you don't have to be abused to be traumatized. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you're bringing that up. I want people to hear that who are listening. It's important. Yeah. And when they're doing the refuge recovery work, I get, it's like a circle, right? It's kind of like 12 step. You come in, you sit, you share, you meditate. Can you tell about what to expect in the moment?
Yeah. So we come together, and we basically read out loud the four truths and the eightfold path, so people understand the structure. And then we do a 20-minute guided meditation. Then we read the book itself. There's a chapter on each of the Four Noble Truths and each of the Eightfold Path and how it relates to addiction. So things like impermanence, things like things being impersonal. That everything is not personal or aimed towards you, so it's a very different way of looking at addiction. Very, very different way of looking at addiction. And then after we read a chapter in the book, then we open up to sharing. And generally you can share on your experience of the meditation, your experience of what we just read, or just whatever's coming up for you. There's many times, the first time that someone has ever sat with themselves for 20 minutes, a lot of stuff will come up. I mean, because I work with all different types of people, and I work with people who've been incarcerated for 10 or 12 years or 15 years. And the first time that they sit with their feelings for 20 minutes, I mean, it can be pretty intense what comes out.
Yeah, I appreciate that too, because I think that's for me again where the somatic piece comes in. Because if you're in a setting where you've had trauma for your whole life, or you've been incarcerated, or you've been addicted, and addiction is a trauma. I mean, it's so incredibly impactful physically on the body, and the stigma from society and how it affects your relationships is extremely traumatizing just to be addicted to something. So when you're coming out of that, like you said, there's this almost debt of emotion and physical experience that you've been numbing against with the substance, or even being in jail and dissociating. You're numbing against that somatic experience of a feeling. So the first time you're in a group like a refuge recovery group, it's, I would imagine, is so cathartic just to be silent for 20 minutes because you're really with that self. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to it, and why I refer so many people to it, because I want people to really feel themselves so they can start understanding the cause, like you were saying, of the suffering, versus there's something wrong with me because I use. It's like, no, there's this feeling that the using is trying to, remediate.
Yeah.
So that's pretty powerful.
It is. It is. And we have another program that was started by Vilmasara, by Dr. Valerie Mason-John, called 8-Step Recovery, which is also based on the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. And it's interesting because that program is a little bit more harm reduction based, whereas Refuge is more abstinence based. So we would like to have the option of either or. And Vimla Sara's program, she gets into a lot of really personal stories about her trauma, because she was, abandoned as a child. She grew up in group homes, and so you really understand the trajectory of her addiction and where it came from. So there's some people really like absolutely love 8-Step, and other people absolutely love Refuge. Some people love both. So we just like to have those options available.
And what interests me right now, before we talk about the center itself, is I am assuming because things are virtual, anyone in the world now can go to the website and join a meeting.
That's correct.
There's no restrictions on that based on states or countries.
Yeah, it's actually pretty cool because we have people that drop in, and I'm like, oh, where are you? And they're like, I'm in Colombia. I was like, wow.
Amazing.
What is addiction like in Colombia? What is the pandemic like in Colombia? What's going on?
That is so beautiful. Oh my goodness. Everyone listening, at the end, I'm going to share the resources, but you can simply, if you're loving what David's talking about and it's piquing your interest, you can go online after you listen to this and go to the website and find the next group. It's amazing. So you can just experience this right away, because you have several every day of the week. Is that correct?
Except Sunday. Sunday
Except
is
Sunday.
But Monday through Saturday, we have groups from 11 a.m. till 9 p.m.
That's incredible. I think that's such a gift that's coming from this pandemic, is someone who can't travel, someone who's in their house and they feel like they're going to use, and they're really scared. They can log on. I mean, that's really powerful.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Tell us about the center itself, which is such a gift to our community. We live in the Hudson Valley in upstate New York, for those of you who don't live around here. And David opened a physical center last year, which is incredible. Tell us about how it functions now, and the dream of what it's blossoming into.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it originally, I just out of sheer perseverance and a very small budget of money, and some of my savings and some other things, and we were able to find a space in Midtown Kingston, which is, for any of you that are local, that's kind of an epicenter of drugs and violence, and a lot of things and it's also an epicenter of really amazing, beautiful, wonderful things, I want to say as well. And wanted to just, I'm very proud to be part of that community. But we were able to, through the generosity of the Methodist Church, we were able to find a space, and basically the idea of Samadhi. And somebody said this to me the other day. They said, I don't know if I'm ready to go to meetings, but I come here because I feel safe. And I was like, wow, you couldn't have given me a better compliment. So basically, we have, there's 6 rooms. There's a big meeting room on the first floor, which is where we do most of our groups and meetings. I mean, we have 70 hours a week well, now about 50 hours a week of programming. Um, so I can't go through all of they're on Facebook. I can't go through all the different classes, but we have body practices like Qigong and trauma informed yoga. We have grief groups. We have women's refuge recovery groups. We have self compassion groups, nonviolent communication, which I'm really excited about. And and basically when you come into the center, if there's always food there, so if you need food, if you need soup when it's cold, if you need a cold drink when it's hot, so we just always have something there to offer you. There's a comfortable place to sit. If you want to join a group, you can join a group. If you want to join a group in the middle, you can join in the middle. If you want to leave before it's over, you can leave before it's over. There's no, because the whole idea is that we don't want to re-traumatize people that are already traumatized. So, I had somebody come in, who's been coming in a lot, and he said he used to be in gangs, and there's a lot of gang violence happening right now. And he said, they keep trying to get me to come back in because they know that I, have a lot of experience. And he said, I don't want to do it. I said, I don't want to do it, Dave. And he said, when I come in here, I'm safe. Nobody can bother me. And I thought, wow, that's pretty incredible. So some all in groups. Some people come. We also train recovery coaches. So those are peers with lived experience that go through a training, and they're available to talk to anyone who wants to. So in other words, if you are dealing with some type of addiction, or you think that you might be dealing with some kind of addiction, there's no. You can just come in and talk to somebody.
What's the cost of all these services?
It's not like you have to go to this group and you have to do this and you have to do that. I generally suggest that people come in and talk to either myself or one of the other peers, just so they can get a sense of what it is that we do. And then you design your own plan, what you want to do.
How do people pay for these services?
So the services are all absolutely free to the community. And that's, through a series of some grants that we've received from both the county and from other organizations. Really amazing, generous donations from the community. We've done Facebook fundraisers, and I'm just amazed. Even after the pandemic, when people don't have jobs, we still were able to raise a considerable amount of money. And then also it's because we have an incredible group of volunteers. I think we have over 30 or 40 volunteers. So mental health professionals, Qigong teachers, who all donate their time for free. So that's really, it's really a community effort as to how we're able to, offer these services for no charge.
You've created such a utopia, really a real one of healing, where you could, like you said, I love when you were saying you can walk in and drink something or have something warm in the winter. You can walk in and have something cold in the summer. You can join a group in the middle. You can leave. You can not join. You can sit in a comfortable chair. What I hear you saying is, you're giving people safe space, like unconditional safe space, where you don't need to pay. You don't have to prove to us that you're wanting to do the work. You just can feel what it's like to feel safe. Mm-hmm. And from my experience with the somatic work with many people, once they feel safety, their body starts to have a comparison of safety and threat. And so when you're saying about the man with the gang in the gang, it was so inspiring to me, because now he has this epicenter in his body and in the Samadhi center of this safe space where nothing's expected of him. Mm-hmm. That might be the first time in his life he's ever felt that. So just that's very healing for anyone, but especially someone with addiction who doesn't feel safety in their body very often. Mm-hmm. That's gorgeous. Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh.
I mean, I want to start to close, because this was such a beautiful interview, and you gave us some beautiful personal accounts, and just a new way to understand addiction and to understand the work that you're doing and other people are doing with you in the center. I think what I love about your story and why I wanted to have you on is because I talk about it, Gabor talks about it, a lot of people talk about it differently, but the general way is trauma becomes a gift. If you can work through it, it becomes this incredible gift. And you're someone that used your trauma and your addiction as a gift. You've turned it into this jewel and helped other people experience that jewel. I think it's really important for people just to witness is what can come out of that kind of pain and isolation and confusion when you get clear.
Yeah.
So I really thank you for that. But I just want to give you the last word, if there is one. Is there anything you want to add or say?
I love what you just said about the trauma being a gift, because I think that's, when people get to a place at Samadhi where they have some stability, we offer them an opportunity to learn how to take their trauma and use it as a gift to help the next person. Because, I'm not going to be around forever. This needs to take on a life of its own, and the community needs to grow. Which is the next steps. We're moving into like transitional housing, and where we actually a larger community of healing. So
I want to end on a Maya Angelou quote, which says, when you learn, teach, and what you get, give. And that's exactly what you're doing. That's what I'm doing. And that's what you're saying these people are doing who are working with you in healing. So thank you so much for your time. Samadhi, SAMADHI, SamadhiNY.org is the website to see everything David and his team are doing. Thank you so much for being here, David.
Thank you, Luis.
So thank you for listening. The resources again are samadhinewyork.org. That's SAMADHINY.org. Anyone in any country, in any time zone, of any background can log on. You can go to the events page and you'll see a calendar every day with endless free resources that you can join right from your computer or your phone. So we can all begin experiencing the healing of this work and the journey of getting to know yourself better so you can find safety in yourself, which would make your addiction obsolete. So as always, before you go, take a breath, feel your body, notice your emotions, and take that awareness into your life. I want to thank you for sharing this space with me. For more information on my work or any events that I might be hosting, please visit holisticlifenavigation.com. And you can find me on Instagram or Facebook at Holistic Life Navigation.